The padlock on that cellar door was rusted shut for 43 years, and when I finally broke it open, I found something worth more than the entire town combined. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button real quick. I've got another story dropping tomorrow that's going to absolutely blow your mind. I was 21 years old when I aged out of Riverside Group Home, standing on the front steps with a garbage bag full of my belongings and exactly $73 to my name. 12 years in the system had taught me not to expect much from life. So when the social worker, Miss Angela, handed me a certified letter from a law office in rural Pennsylvania, I figured it was some kind of mistake. The letter was from an attorney named Patricia Moore, informing me that a woman named Ruth Calloway had passed away 6 months earlier at the age of 89. I'd never heard the name before in my life. But according to the letter, Ruth Calloway was my great-aunt, my grandmother's sister, and she'd left me her property in a town called Millbrook, about 3 hours west of Philadelphia. The property consisted of 5 acres of land and a barn. Just a barn. No house, no livestock, nothing else. Just an old barn that, according to the letter, had been abandoned for over 4 decades. I called the number on the letterhead immediately, and Miss Moore answered on the second ring. She had a kind voice that reminded me of the librarian who used to let me stay after hours when I had nowhere else to go. "Miss Calloway," she said, and hearing someone call me that instead of just my case number felt strange. "I'm glad you called. Your great-aunt was very specific about wanting you to have this property. She tracked you down through social services about a year before she passed." "Why did she leave me a barn?" I asked, not understanding why someone I'd never met would leave me anything, let alone something that sounded completely useless. Miss Moore paused. Ruth was a complicated woman. She lived in town until she moved into assisted living 5 years ago. The barn was her father's, your great-grandfather's, and she refused to sell the land, even though everyone told her she should. She said it needed to stay in the family, and when she found out you existed, she was determined you should have it. "Is there any money to go with it?" I asked, trying not to sound desperate, but knowing I needed to be practical. "There's a small amount," Miss Moore said. "About $3,000 that was left after settling her estate and paying for the property taxes. It's enough to keep the taxes current for about 2 years, maybe help you get started if you decide to do anything with the land." $3,000 sounded like a fortune to someone who'd never had more than a few hundred at once. But a barn with no house? I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that. Miss Moore must have sensed my confusion. "Listen, why don't you come see it before you make any decisions? The barn is in rough shape, I won't lie to you. But the land is yours free and clear, and that's worth something. At the very least, you could sell it and use the money to get started somewhere." I agreed to meet her the following week. I used most of my money to take a Greyhound bus to a town called Bradford, the closest station to Millbrook, and Miss Moore picked me up from there in a sensible sedan that smelled like vanilla air freshener. Millbrook was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. We drove down a main street with antique shops, a diner called Betty's Place, and a hardware store that looked like it hadn't changed since 1950. Miss Moore kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling me about Ruth. "She was a teacher," Miss Moore said. Taught at the elementary school for 41 years. Never married, no children of her own. But she touched a lot of lives in this community. When people found out she left her property to a relative no one knew about, there was quite a bit of talk. I could imagine. Small towns loved their gossip. We turned onto a gravel road that wound through farmland and patches of forest. After about 2 miles, Miss Moore slowed and pulled onto an overgrown driveway, barely visible through the weeds and wild bushes. "Here we are," she said, and I looked out the window at what had to be the sorriest structure I'd ever seen. The barn was massive, probably 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, but it looked like a strong wind would knock it over. The red paint had faded to a dull rust color, peeling off in long strips that curled away from the weathered wood. The roof sagged dramatically in the middle, and several boards were missing from the walls, creating gaps that let sunlight stream through. Weeds grew up around the foundation, some of them taller than I was, and the whole thing tilted slightly to one side like it was tired of standing. "Oh," I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. "It's been empty since 1982, Miss Moore explained. Ruth's father used it for dairy farming until he passed away. Ruth kept the land, but never had any use for the barn. She paid to have the roof patched a few times over the years to keep it from collapsing completely, but that's about it." We got out of the car, and I walked slowly toward the barn, my shoes crunching on gravel and dead grass. Up close, it looked even worse. The doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, and when I pulled one open, it scraped against the ground with a sound that made my teeth hurt. Inside was dim and dusty, with shafts of sunlight cutting through the holes in the walls and roof. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of use, and then decades of abandonment. Old farming equipment sat rusting in corners. Wooden stalls that had once held cows stood empty and rotting. Birds had built nests in the rafters, and I could hear something scurrying away in the darkness, probably rats. "I know it's not much to look at," Miss Moore said gently. That was an understatement. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. This was a disaster. I couldn't live here, couldn't do anything with it. The smart thing would be to sell the land and use the money to start over somewhere else. But as I stood there in that broken barn, breathing in the smell of old wood and earth, I felt something unexpected. Connection. This place belonged to my family, to people I'd never known, but whose blood I shared. For someone who'd spent her whole life feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, that meant something. "Can I look around more?" I asked. Miss Moore nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait in the car." I spent the next hour exploring every corner of the barn. I found old milk cans, rusted tools, a tractor that looked like it hadn't run since the 1960s. In what must have been a tack room, I discovered shelves full of mason jars covered in dust and cobwebs, their contents long since spoiled. Everything spoke of a life that had ended abruptly, frozen in time when Ruth's father died, and she'd closed up the barn for good. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd. In the back corner of the barn, hidden behind a pile of rotting hay bales, there was a section of floor that looked different from the rest. The dirt there was darker, more compacted, and when I pushed the hay aside, I found wooden boards underneath, arranged in a rectangular pattern about 4 feet by 6 feet. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed one of the old tools, a crowbar that was more rust than metal, and started prying up the boards. They came up easier than I expected, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. A cellar. There was a cellar under the barn. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it down into the black opening. The steps looked solid, carved from stone, leading about 10 feet down to what appeared to be a door. I should have gone back to get Miss Moore. I should have been more careful. But curiosity pulled at me like a physical force. I needed to know what was down there. The steps were steep and narrow, and I had to brace myself against the stone walls as I descended. The air grew colder with each step, and I could smell earth and something else, something almost sweet, like old paper. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door with an ancient padlock holding it shut. The lock was completely rusted, the kind that had been exposed to moisture for decades. I went back up, grabbed a hammer from the collection of old tools, and spent 20 minutes beating at the lock until it finally broke apart. The door swung open with a groan that echoed in the confined space, and I shined my light inside. What I saw made me forget to breathe. The cellar was actually a room about 20 feet square with stone walls and a surprisingly intact ceiling. And covering every available surface, stacked on shelves, piled on tables, and carefully stored in wooden crates, were paintings. Dozens of them, maybe 100, all different sizes, from small canvases no bigger than a book to massive pieces that had to be 5 feet tall. I stepped inside, moving the light from one to another, and they were breathtaking. Landscapes, portraits, still lifes, abstract pieces that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light from my phone. The style varied, suggesting they'd been painted over many years, but there was a consistent quality to them, a mastery of color and light that made even my untrained eye recognize their beauty. In the corner of the room, I found an easel with a half-finished painting still resting on it, as if the artist had just stepped away and planned to return. Next to it was a palette with dried paint and a collection of brushes in a ceramic jar. Someone had created all of this. Someone had painted these incredible works and then hidden them down here, sealing them away from the world. I found a date, painted small, in the corner of one canvas, 1979. Another was dated 1981. The half-finished piece on the easel had 1982 written on the back of the canvas. These had been painted right before the barn was abandoned. My hands shook as I examined painting after painting. Some depicted the Pennsylvania countryside, rolling hills and farmland that I recognized from the drive here. Others showed the interior of the barn itself, captured in loving detail when it was still in good condition. There were portraits of a man with kind eyes and weathered hands, probably my great-grandfather. And there were self-portraits of a woman with dark hair and intense eyes, staring out from the canvas with an expression that was both defiant and sad. In a wooden trunk, I found journals, dozens of leather-bound books filled with writing in neat, precise handwriting. I opened one at random and read, "Father says I'm wasting my time, that painting is a hobby, not a life. He doesn't understand that this is the only time I feel truly alive, when I have a brush in my hand and a blank canvas in front of me. But he's getting older, and there's no one else to run the farm. What kind of daughter would I be if I abandoned him to chase a dream?" The signature at the bottom was just an initial, R. Ruth. These were Ruth's paintings. My great-aunt, the elementary school teacher who'd lived her whole life in this small town, had been an artist, a real artist, with incredible talent, and she'd hidden it all down here in this cellar. I spent the next 3 hours reading through the journals, piecing together her story. Ruth had discovered her love of painting in high school, had dreamed of going to art school in Philadelphia or New York. But her mother had died young, leaving her father alone to run the dairy farm. Ruth had stayed to help him, taking a job at the local school to contribute to the household income while spending every spare moment painting in the barn. I've been accepted to the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, one entry from 1958 read, "Full scholarship. It's everything I've dreamed of. But Father had another heart attack last week, and the doctor says he needs to take it easy. How can I leave him now?" She never went. Year after year she taught school, helped on the farm, and painted in secret. The journals revealed that she'd tried to show her work a few times, entering pieces in local art shows. But her father had been embarrassed by it, thinking it wasn't proper for a woman to draw attention to herself that way. So Ruth had stopped trying to share her art and just kept creating it, storing everything in the cellar where no one would see it. The last journal entry was dated March 1982, just a month before her father died. "Father is gone, 54 years old, and I'm finally free to do what I want. But what do I want? I'm too old to start over, too tired to chase the dreams I had as a girl. The paintings in the cellar are all I have to show for a life spent waiting. I can't look at them anymore. They're just reminders of everything I gave up. I'm sealing the cellar tomorrow. Maybe someday someone will find them and understand." I sat on the cold stone floor of that cellar, crying for a woman I'd never met. Ruth had sacrificed her dreams, buried her talent, and lived a life of quiet regret. And now, 43 years later, I was the one who'd broken open that seal. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stay with me, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I climbed out of the cellar as the sun was starting to set, my mind racing with possibilities. Miss Moore was waiting in her car, and when she saw my face, she got out immediately. "What happened? Are you okay?" "There's a cellar," I said, my voice shaking. "Under the barn. It's full of paintings, Ruth's paintings. She was an artist, a real artist, and no one knew." Miss Moore's eyes widened. "Paintings? Ruth painted?" "Come see," I said, and led her down into the cellar. Her reaction was the same as mine: shock, awe, and then deep sadness as she read through some of the journals and understood what Ruth had hidden away. "I taught with Ruth for 15 years, Miss Moore said quietly. "I considered her a friend, and I never knew about any of this. She never mentioned it once." We stood there in the dim cellar, surrounded by the evidence of a secret life, and I made a decision. "I'm keeping the barn," I said. "I'm going to fix it up, and I'm going to show these paintings. Ruth spent her whole life hiding her talent. I'm not going to let that continue." Miss Moore looked at me with concern. "That's a beautiful sentiment, but do you have any idea what you're taking on? This barn needs serious work. The roof alone will cost thousands of dollars to replace. And you'd need to restore all these paintings, get them properly appraised, find venues willing to show them. It's a massive undertaking." "I know," I said, "but I have to try. Someone has to tell her story." The next few months were the hardest of my life. I moved into a tiny efficiency apartment in Millbrook, working 3 jobs to save money while slowly, painfully slowly, making repairs to the barn. I waitressed at Betty's place, stocked shelves at the hardware store, and cleaned houses on weekends. Every spare dollar went toward materials and professional help for the things I couldn't do myself. The town thought I was crazy. People would stop me on the street to tell me I was wasting my time, that the barn was beyond saving, that I should just tear it down and sell the land. The comments stung, especially when they came from people who'd known Ruth and should have cared about preserving her legacy. "That old barn's been an eyesore for 40 years," one old man told me at the hardware store. "Your aunt had the right idea leaving it alone. Best thing you could do is bulldoze it and put up something useful." But I kept going. I learned to patch roofing, replace boards, and shore up foundations. I watched YouTube videos and read library books on building restoration. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the barn started to look less like it was about to collapse and more like something that might survive another winter. I contacted art historians at nearby colleges, asking for help identifying and appraising Ruth's work. A professor named Dr. Sarah Martinez from Penn State came out to see the collection, and her excitement was immediate and genuine. "This is extraordinary," she said, carefully examining painting after painting. "Your great-aunt had genuine talent. These landscapes are reminiscent of the Pennsylvania Impressionists, but with a unique voice. And the technical skill is remarkable, especially considering she was self-taught." Dr. Martinez helped me understand what I had. She estimated that with proper restoration and marketing, the collection could be worth several $100,000. But more importantly, she believed Ruth's work deserved to be seen and appreciated, not as a commercial venture, but as an important piece of regional art history. "What she captured here," Dr. Martinez said, gesturing to a painting of the barn in its prime, sunlight streaming through open doors onto fresh hay, "is a way of life that's disappearing. These paintings are historical documents as much as they are art." With Dr. Martinez's help, I started planning an exhibition. We secured space at a gallery in Lancaster, a bigger town about an hour away, for a show that would open in November, just over a year after I'd first arrived in Millbrook. The restoration work was painstaking. Each painting had to be carefully cleaned, examined for damage, and professionally photographed. I maxed out credit cards and borrowed money from people who believed in what I was doing, all while continuing to work multiple jobs and live on almost nothing. The barn renovation continued. In parallel, I couldn't afford to hire contractors for everything, so I did what I could myself. I scraped and painted, replaced rotten boards, and cleaned decades of accumulated dirt and debris. Neighbors who'd initially mocked my efforts started stopping by to help. Tom, who ran the hardware store, donated materials at cost. Betty from the diner organized a community workday where a dozen people showed up to help re-shingle the roof. "Ruth was a good woman," Betty told me as we worked side by side. "She taught my kids, and she was always kind. I'm sorry she felt like she had to hide this part of herself. What you're doing, honoring her memory like this, it matters." The gallery opening was scheduled for November 14th. By November 1st, I was exhausted, broke, and terrified that no one would come. We'd sent invitations to art collectors, historians, and media contacts that Dr. Martinez had provided. We'd created a website telling Ruth's story and showcasing images of her work. But I had no idea if anyone would actually show up to see paintings by an unknown elementary school teacher from rural Pennsylvania. The night before the opening, I couldn't sleep. I drove out to the barn, which now looked transformed. The roof was solid, the walls were patched and painted, and new doors hung straight on their hinges. It would never be perfect, but it was saved. Inside, I'd created a small studio space with the easel and Ruth's painting supplies, preserved exactly as I'd found them, as a tribute to the work she'd done here. I sat on the floor of the cellar, now cleaned and fitted with proper lighting, and read through Ruth's journals one more time. I felt like I knew her, this woman I'd never met. I understood her sacrifices, her regrets, and her quiet courage in continuing to create even when no one would see what she made. "I hope this is what you would have wanted," I whispered to the empty room. "I hope you know that your work mattered, that you mattered." The gallery opening exceeded every hope I'd dared to have. Over 200 people showed up, filling the space to capacity. Art collectors from Philadelphia and New York came to see what the buzz was about. Local media covered the story, fascinated by the discovery of a hidden artist. And the people of Millbrook came out in force, many of them crying as they recognized the landscapes and buildings that Ruth had painted, places they'd known all their lives captured forever on canvas. The paintings sold, not all of them, because I kept some for myself and donated others to museums and historical societies. But enough sold that I made over $300,000, more money than I'd ever imagined having. More importantly, Ruth's story reached people. Art magazines wrote articles about her. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about doing a short film. Students at the elementary school where she'd taught started a program teaching art to kids whose families couldn't afford lessons, naming it the Ruth Calloway Creative Arts Initiative. Ruth had been right that no one would remember a quiet elementary school teacher, but they would remember her art. They would remember the woman who painted in secret for 40 years, creating beauty that she never expected anyone to see simply because she couldn't not create it. I used some of the money to finish renovating the barn, turning it into a proper art studio and gallery space. The rest I invested and saved, finally having the security I'd never known growing up. But the most valuable thing I gained wasn't financial. I'd found my purpose. Working with Ruth's art, telling her story, and seeing the impact it had on people showed me what I wanted to do with my life. I went back to school, studying art history and museum curation. I started advocating for other hidden artists, particularly women whose work had been overlooked or dismissed during their lifetimes. The barn became my home base, a place where I could display rotating exhibitions of local artists, teach workshops, and continue to share Ruth's story. The building that everyone had said was worthless, that I should tear down and forget, became a center for creativity and community. 2 years after that first opening, I organized a permanent exhibition at the barn, featuring Ruth's remaining paintings and her journals. I hired a local carpenter to build display cases for her brushes and palettes, preserving them as artifacts of her creative process. And I painted a mural on the barn's exterior, visible from the road, with Ruth's face and the words, "She created in secret so we could celebrate in public." The traveling exhibition of Ruth's work continued for 3 more years, showing in galleries across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Each opening brought new people into contact with her story, and many of them told me about their own hidden passions, the things they'd always wanted to do but hadn't pursued because of fear or obligation or the weight of other people's expectations. Your aunt's story gave me courage to start painting again, one older woman told me at an exhibition in Philadelphia. I gave it up when I got married, thought I had to focus on being a good wife and mother. But I'm 67 now, and if I don't start again now, I never will. Thank you for showing me it's not too late. Those conversations made everything worthwhile. Ruth's art was valuable, but her story was priceless. She became a symbol for everyone who'd ever buried their dreams, who'd ever chosen duty over desire, who'd ever wondered if their creative voice mattered. I thought about my own journey often, how I'd gone from a foster kid with nothing to someone who'd rescued and celebrated an incredible legacy. The broken barn that everyone mocked had given me more than financial security. It had given me identity, purpose, and a connection to family I'd never known. 5 years after inheriting the property, I stood in the barn during another exhibition opening. The space was filled with people admiring Ruth's landscapes, reading her journals behind glass displays, and talking about the courage it takes to create. Miss Moore was there, now retired from her law practice, but still a regular visitor. Dr. Martinez had brought a group of students from Penn State, and scattered throughout the crowd were former foster kids I'd mentored, young people who'd found their own paths forward with a little support and encouragement. Tom from the hardware store appeared at my elbow. "You proved us all wrong," he said with a smile. "When you first showed up talking about saving that old barn, I thought you'd be gone in a month. But you had vision. You saw what nobody else could see." "I just saw what Ruth wanted me to see," I said. "She left me the barn for a reason. She couldn't share her work during her life, but she made sure someone would find it eventually. I'm just the one who was lucky enough to be chosen." That night, after the crowds had left and the barn was quiet, I walked down to the cellar where I'd first discovered Ruth's secret. The space was empty now, all the paintings either sold, displayed upstairs, or carefully stored in climate-controlled facilities. But I could still feel her presence there, the echo of all those hours she'd spent creating beauty that no one would see. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, something I'd started doing when I wanted to remember important moments. "Dear Ruth," I said into the quiet room, "I hope you can somehow know what your gift has meant. You gave me more than property or money. You gave me proof that it's never too late for your work to matter, that creating something beautiful is worthwhile, even if you never get to see it celebrated. You taught me that hidden doesn't mean worthless, and that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we have to dig for." I paused, collecting my thoughts. The barn is going to stand for a long time now. It's solid and beautiful, and every day people come here to see what you made, to learn your story, to be inspired by your courage and your quiet rebellion against a world that told you your art didn't matter. You were wrong about one thing, though. You thought no one would remember you, but they will. We'll make sure of it. I turned off the recording and climbed the stone steps for the last time that night. The barn's new security system beeped as I locked the door. a far cry from the rusty padlock that had hidden Ruth's secret for so long. Driving back to my apartment, passing fields and farmhouses under a sky full of stars, I thought about all the people who told me to give up, to sell the worthless barn, and move on with my life. They'd seen an eyesore, a liability, a problem to be solved, but I'd seen possibility, and that made all the difference. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep sharing these incredible true stories of hidden treasures and second chances. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered something valuable that everyone else overlooked? What hidden talents or dreams are you keeping locked away? Share your story with our community and click on one of the stories on your screen to keep the inspiration going. Until next time, remember that what others call worthless might just be priceless.